June 1967. Israel was besieged by three brutal enemies and had to fight them all at once: Egypt, Jordan, Syria. At stake was the survival of a nation, the life of every Jewish citizen of Israel. The greatest threat came from Egypt, where the match was horribly lopsided. Egypt deployed 100,000 troops in the Sinai Peninsula, while Israel had mobilized 45,000. In machinery and firepower as well, the numbers were heavily unbalanced in Egypt's favor. On June 5th, at 7:14 a.m., Israel's Air Force executed a preemptive attack, striking hard in Egypt's own territory. In 2 furious hours, Egypt's Air Force virtually ceased to exist, and its airfields were rendered unusable. But Israel could not rely on an aerial attack alone. Just 15 minutes after her fighter jets roared into action, her ground forces confronted the enormous armored enemy that menaced Sinai. Israel divided its attack force into 3 divisions. All faced heavy tank battles against exceptional odds. The 1st Division, led by Major General Israel Tau, fought its way to El Arish, the fortified capital of the Sinai Peninsula, along the banks of the Mediterranean. By the next morning, June 6th, El Arish was in Israeli hands. Its last guns fell silent the following night, and neighboring Gaza was conquered that same day. Meanwhile, a 2nd Division, led by Ariel Sharon, headed for the strategic northern junction of Abu Agila. Sharon confused his entrenched enemy by attacking at night from multiple directions. By mid-morning on June 6th, Sharon had secured all strategic areas. A 3rd Reserve Division, led by Brigadier General Avraham Yoff, split in 2. One half silently penetrated Wadi Hiradin, an undefended natural barrier that Egypt considered impassable. This aided Sharon by preventing enemy reinforcements from joining the battles raging in Rafah and Abu Agila. The other half joined General Tau in a pincer attack against the key high ground of Jebel Libni, where the Egyptians maintained control of their 2nd, deeper defense line. By the evening of June 6th, the high grounds had fallen. The afternoon of June 6th found the Egyptian military elite in panic, issuing contradictory orders and abandoning their troops to disorderly retreat. 2 IDF divisions raced to the Suez Canal. Their mission was to block off the Egyptian retreat, allowing the 3rd Division to drive the escaping enemy into a trap and preventing any chance of regrouping. On June 7th, Israel's Navy, joined by a paratrooper unit, arrived in abandoned Sharm el-Sheikh on the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. On June 8, IDF forces reached the Suez Canal. By June 9th, the entirety of Sinai and Gaza was in Israeli hands. Egypt had lost its air force and its army, and had been soundly defeated. It promptly signed a ceasefire. The Sinai, however, was not Israel's only front. On the first morning of war, June 5th, as Egypt's airfield lay smoldering, and with its Sinai forces under heavy attack, Egypt lied to Jordan by claiming false victories over Israel. Egypt ordered its ally to attack Israel. At precisely 9 a.m. on the 5th of June, Jordanian planes and artillery bombarded Israeli positions and airfields, and unleashed an inferno against the unprotected civilians of Jerusalem. Israel appealed for Jordan to stay its hand. General Od Bull of the UN's peacekeeping force relayed a message from Israeli Prime Minister Eshkol to Jordan's King Hussein. "We are engaged in defensive fighting on the Egyptian sector, and we shall not engage ourselves in any action against Jordan unless Jordan attacks us. Should Jordan attack Israel, we shall go against her with all our might, and the king will have to bear the full responsibility of the consequences." But at 11 a.m., King Hussein formally rejected Israel's overtures. His reply was blunt: "It is too late. The die has been cast." By 12:30, Jordanian shelling shrieked to the tune of a full-blown assault, causing multiple deaths, almost 1,000 wounded, and a trail of destruction. Once again, Israeli jets tore through the skies, rapidly demolishing the entire Jordanian Air Force, allowing Israel's ground forces to capture key border positions, such as the Kalkilia Junction and Latrun stronghold. After this punishment, Israel waited for the heavily bruised Jordan to reconsider, to no avail. Left with no choice, on June 6th, the IDF met the Jordanian army head-on in the West Bank. The struggle to rescue Jerusalem was bitter and costly, but after 2 days of close combat, Israel captured the Old City. Outside of Jerusalem, the bloodiest battle was the Battle of the Dotan Valley. Israel intended a limited struggle to neutralize long-range artillery fire near Jenin. But the war was unintentionally expanded as the battle spread across Judea and Samaria. On the morning of June 7th, Israeli forces arrived at the Samarian city of Shechem, or Nablus. Its residents mistook the IDF for Iraqi troops and welcomed them, but soon realized their error and resisted bitterly until the city fell later that night. East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank fell with little resistance on June 7th. Israel captured Jericho, the Jordan Valley, the Gush Etzion area, and the Judean cities of Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, Tul-Karem, and Kalkilia. Jordan had suffered a crushing defeat. At 8 p.m. on June 7th, Jordan signed a ceasefire. Israel now controlled the densely populated West Bank, although many locals had fled to Jordan ahead of the Israeli advance. Beside Egypt and Jordan, Israel faced one other major menace: Syria. The Golan mountain range was under Syrian control and heavily fortified, turning Israel's towns into sitting ducks. On the first day of war, Syria's air force had attacked Israel, which responded by eliminating its enemy's air force. The following day, June 6, a Syrian ground invasion of Israel was repelled. Licking its wounds, Syria spent the next 2 days raining destruction on Israeli villages from atop the Golan Heights. Israel bled but could not respond. They were up to their necks in the effective destruction of Egypt and Jordan's armed forces. But when those enemies signed ceasefires, Israel turned a sharp eye to the Syrian bombardment of its northern civilians. Years of sporadic shelling had been a primary instigator of this war, and Israel could not sheathe its sword before pointing its blade at Damascus. On June 9th, Major General David Elazar was ordered to storm the Golan. It was literally an uphill battle, to a plateau some 2,000 feet in the air. The mountain bristled with heavy fortifications, minefields, and trenches. After Israel's air force shook the mountainside for 3 hours, its ground forces inched painfully upwards from 5 locations in the northern Hula Valley, exposed to enemy fire all the way. The main attack was towards the town of Kala, where Syrian defenses were weaker due to the impenetrability of the steep cliffs. Sappers cleared mines. Then bulldozers created roads. Then tanks clambered up in single file, accompanied by troops. The invasion took several hours at the tragic cost of heavy casualties, but the strongholds of Kala, Tel Azizat, Tel Fakir, Dardara, and Tel Hillel were taken. On the morning of the 10th, Israel captured Banias and Mansara, leaving their path clear to Kenitra, the regional capital and center of Syrian military command, which fell without a fight. In just 1 day of terrible fighting, the strategically crucial Golan Heights was in Israeli hands, removing the nearly 20-year-long threat that towered over northern Israel. With the elimination of the Syrian, Jordanian, and Egyptian threat in just 6 days, Israel not only survived, but tripled in size. The war was won.